Well, my name is Richard Long. As one of the MHA consultants, my focus is on the technology side. I do business continuity work as well. Actually, I'm in the middle of doing a BIA, some BIA work as we speak. So kind of taking a little break to do this, but kind of focus on the technology side. So what we're going to talk about today is this DR testing. And so some of you may know MHA, so I'm going to, because we got started late, I'm not going to spend really any time on this, but we've been around for quite a long time. Most of us have been in the industry for 20 or more years. I never thought I was that old until my grandkids start coming over and telling me that I'm old. So I guess I have a little bit, at least some experience around that. So a lot of what we do is in the disaster recovery realm and working with clients. This is just our kind of our client pedigree. Kind of goes across the various verticals, retail, finance, hospitality, government, public sector, et cetera. So we've seen a lot of different organizations at a lot of different levels of maturity and really testing needs. We do go across the entire gamut of business continuity, both from strategies to plan development, exercising, and then also helping people actually maintain and manage their program. One of the things I probably should have mentioned at the beginning is, this is really open forum. So if you have any questions, feel free to send a chat or just interrupt. Please go ahead and jump in and ask your question. Really want to make this as interactive as possible if you have thoughts or comments or questions as I'm going through this. So one of the things that we want to make sure, one of the things that we understand these days is really the importance of standards and compliance. And that's becoming a much bigger deal. And so as people are doing testing specifically that we talked about today, a lot of that is because of standards and requirements that companies or their auditors or the regulations that they're under have required. And so you can kind of see across the board when we look at business continuity, this is one small area, but across everything, as you think about your exercises, how does not only the IT side, but how does your fire and life safety, what's your supply chain risk, third-party management, those kind of things are definitely, it can be impactful as you think about the tests. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So our focus today is going to be kind of on scope, who should participate, what are some of the exercises, and then kind of getting into the planning and executing of those. And there's going to be some variations here. So a lot of the content on the slides may seem straightforward, but hopefully as we talk, there'll be a lot more depth and content as it relates to that, because it's kind of tough to try to put in a few slides all the stuff and all of the things that we want to take into consideration. At this point, are there any questions, or is there anything that somebody would really like, a question that you have in mind that you really want to make sure is answered so that we can make sure we do that? Or a concern that you might have that we can make sure we address for you? All right. So as we think about testing, one of the things that we do want to consider here is kind of where does all of this fit within the overall business continuity perspective, right? And so I think clearly everybody on the call knows that we've got the business continuity and getting the business functioning again. And part of that is the IT disaster recovery, making sure those systems and applications and technologies are available to support all of the business processes. And then there's the crisis management. And again, the IT DR planning and the DR testing needs to take both of those into account. We'll talk about that as we talk about scope and some of the complexities. But making sure that we have those touch points included in our tests can be very important. So, even though a lot of us on this call, and I myself being more of an IT person, focus on that, we want to make sure that we really look at how all of this fits into the bigger picture and is integrated. So just to make sure as we're talking, really when we think of business continuity, that's really the business functions. And then as a kind of as a subset, if you will, of that is the disaster recovery, which is the systems and processing. And then when we're doing BIAs and we're talking about these various recoveries, we really want to focus on, you know, what is the process that's being recovered and making sure that that's appropriate. And then from an IT perspective, then we're focusing on all the applications that are then used for the process to be functional again. Here I might be getting a little bit of noise. Let me see if I can adjust a little bit. Hopefully that's a little bit better. If not, let me know. So everything that we do here, we kind of want to look at this as a balance. So kind of from we think it as a big picture perspective is, you know, it's all about risk and costs and everything else. And this is especially important as it relates to our DR tests. Sometimes we'd like to do more, or we have a need to do more, but based on the availability of individuals, some of the capabilities that we might have to adjust that. So always want to keep that in mind rather than saying this is the only way to do something. Some years we might have to skinny things down. Other years we might have, you know, we can go in a little bit larger scope or be a little bit more complex. So the DR tests really kind of fit within the overall, you know, disaster recovery program and strategy. It's really that validation of the strategy and implementation. But we don't want to forget that, you know, testing isn't the end all be all. Testing is really just the validation of everything else that we do, from plans to contacts, you know, and then obviously the overall strategy and implementation, you know. So kind of consider that as we go through the discussion today. So as we kind of start, what is a DR exercise? And so as we talk through this, if any of you have any opinions or thoughts, please jump in. But from our perspective, what a DR exercise is all about is really a reality-based scenario that's really going to require technical recovery. And we like to add that scenario in and say, this is why we're recovering, as opposed to saying we're just going to recover systems. That kind of becomes a technical exercise. Sometimes when we do these exercises, people will want to make them fun, if you will, right? And I know a few years ago, a lot of scenarios were around, we're going to have a zombie apocalypse and go through that. We really discourage those kind of things because we want these to be reality-based. And while it might be fun to think about that and it might make it a little bit more enjoyable, it almost becomes a game, and we don't want these to be a game. So kind of thinking in terms of a reality scenario and what is actually going to happen is very important. You know, clearly it's an opportunity to validate the technical recovery and to go about, you know, the strategy and the details. But also the point of an exercise is really around training, making sure that the technical team know how to execute the plans, that they know what to do and how to follow the plans rather than trying to do things off of memory. Also, that we talked about that integration between the business functions and what they need to do, as well as the emergency management of a recovery, making sure that at least in some way we talk through how would we be communicating, what would be the handoff points to business, what would be the handoff points between crisis management or even the IT crisis management and the actual recovery teams, as opposed to thinking that in terms of, you know, just a recovery exercise. And then what we think is one of the greatest opportunities is really identifying weaknesses, gaps, issues, all of those type of things, the procedures in terms of the exercise. It's really not intended to be just a rubber stamp that says, and we completed it and it was perfect. One of the things we'll see is one of the main goals for us is really identifying what do we need to go work on to become more functional. Are there any questions or comments as it relates to kind of in general what, from that perspective, what a DR exercise is supposed to accomplish? All right. The other thing is we don't view a DR exercise as a success or a failure. It's really not a binary conversation. From our perspective, success is, were you able to recover no matter how difficult it might have been? And even if there were problems, issues, etc., then from our perspective, it was a success. Also, what did you find that needs to be modified, changed, improved, resolved? And were individuals more knowledgeable once they left that exercise? I've often been asked, or after an exercise, somebody will come back and says, that was just a failure. It was a horrible example. We can't recover. When in reality, people were able to recover all of the systems and were able to test through and validate. It just took a lot more effort maybe than people were anticipating. And there were several, a number of issues identified. That really was a success. And so in our minds, failure is actually, if you don't find issues and everything was perfect, then it probably was a failure. And I like to joke a little bit that if you didn't have any issues, either the scope was way too narrow, you really are perfect, which is probably not true, or somebody did not report what the actual issues were, and we're not being completely open and honest about the results. There have been cases where we have not been able to perform a recovery on applications due to some serious technical issues. In that case, we kind of did consider that a failure in the sense that we couldn't even start recovering systems, or we couldn't even get logged in. So I think that's potentially a fair statement. But in general, there was some success to it because we found some issues in the architecture that needed to be addressed. And had that not happened, the organization was just going along assuming that everything would be fine. So short, kind of short answer to what is an exercise. It really is the opportunity to validate your strategy and also find issues that can be corrected. Any thoughts or disagreements on that at all? Hopefully that's pretty straightforward, and sometimes that idea of what is the purpose of the exercise is really a communication need as the planning is going on, which we'll talk a little bit about. So the expectations are set appropriately. So what types of exercises do we see and can you do? And these are probably very well known, and you probably understand them, but do want to make sure that they can be integrated. So the first that we'll see is a tabletop, and that can actually be very beneficial even from an IT perspective. Really to look through and make sure that the processes and dependencies are correct, the touch points, the communication points, so that people, when they actually perform an actual recovery, the coordination is already set up and the dependencies are there, so steps and things are not missed. Outside of that, then we'll look at what we would consider just a technical exercise. This can often be the database administrators, server team, storage team are getting, and components of the recovery strategy are tested. So maybe if you're using a highly virtualized environment using SRM, for example, or Zerto, you might look at it and just do a Zerto test. It could be a very small component of that Zerto, or it could be a much more encompassing, where you do all of the servers that are in your virtual environment, but you're not trying to necessarily get business users in, but you want to make sure that the technical components actually work, that they can perform functionally, that they have enough performance, all of those type of things from a technical perspective, to make sure everything is functional. Then there's kind of the stand-up exercise. Once we're comfortable that all the various technical components are put together, then we may look at, let's do a single application, or maybe a few applications, to make sure that the integration across all of those technical components work. So we're really validating the overall strategy, as opposed to trying to bring everything up in one fell swoop. One of the things that you're going to hear is a progression of exercises is often the best solution, as opposed to, once you've implemented, let's just start everything up and see how it goes. While that's a good thing to do, and in our definition of, is it successful, is it not, it's probably okay, but you'll probably identify a lot of issues and may get wrapped up in some of the difficulties, as opposed to kind of progressively moving across the increased scope of an exercise. Once we've looked at stand-up exercises, or even we do some of those, one of the important things is the integration side. Just recently having a conversation with a client about this as it relates to DR exercises. And they've pretty much done kind of more multiple application and pretty heavily scoped stand-up exercises, where they'll log in, they'll check functionality, but really haven't done the integration between systems. And this is absolutely key from a DR exercise perspective, and including them in your strategy and in your schedule, so that we understand, will the applications actually talk to each other? One of the things we hear a lot is, well, it will work because all the connections will be there. And yet we don't always know what those, if there's special configuration, special permissions that aren't necessarily always recovered. We assume they are, but until we test them, we don't really see. The other thing about integration testing is making sure that there's a data consistency. Again, a lot of folks will assume that all of their interfacing and their integrations will self-heal. The question is, are you really sure they will self-heal? And that things aren't missing, or there are certain processes that need to be manually run to get caught up. Without doing that testing as part of the exercise, that can be difficult to know until a real event hits, and now you're scrambling. We do a lot of including our business partners, the functional teams coming in and doing testing. One of the things that's becoming more and more important now is also third party, with your SaaS solutions. If you have folks from the outside, vendors that access systems, all of those type of things can be really important to include in the testing as well. And so we'll kind of call that out, both from a scope and from a test type of perspective, making sure we're including all of that. And included with that could be an actual relocation and productive execution. So on top of just doing a DR test where production is protected, if you're in such a state, actually fail over and run productively. We've actually had a couple of clients do that on a regular basis, where they, unannounced, people will walk into the building and they'll say, we're executing our relocation and our DR plan. You need to go to your alternate work site. They do, the systems have been failed over, and they run productively for that day or 2 days, and then they bring them back. The other thing to consider from a DR exercise perspective is a 24/7 versus a work hours exercise. A lot of times it's difficult, to do a 24/7 exercise because of resources. On the other hand, that's all people want to do is, well, we have to do a 24 because we have to get an idea of what reality is going to be. Both are absolutely true, but both of these can fit in. There are times that in order to get a DR exercise in, maybe within the scope that you'd like, you want to increase the scope, but you can't get all of the same people together for that, 2 or 3 day period. So maybe breaking it out over a week period. We actually have a client that we can't do that, and so we kind of actually run a 24/7 exercise from a management perspective, but from an execution perspective, we can't do that. The management side is because they're also a global organization. We're moving across time zones, but those time zones may only work during their business hours, and then come back the next day to finish up. And then, as you can see, ideally, then you kind of take all of these and can kind of roll them up into a potentially a combination of all of them, and call that your exercise, where you do some integration, just some stand-up, maybe just some technical exercises, and mix and match all of these type of concepts. Any questions or? Okay. So planning. As we think about what the planning is required, is we really like to think in terms of plan, but not implementation. So the DR plan, the planning for your exercise should not be about implementing necessarily gaps and fixing everything that you identify. Now that happens, and sometimes that's part of the schedule, but that kind of gives a false sense of security when an exercise occurs and it goes relatively well. And we're like, look, we have all of this. But in reality, if you had just executed that exercise right at the beginning of your planning stage, kind of as a non-announced exercise, you would recognize that it wouldn't have gone well because you fixed so many things in the planning phase. Now, that doesn't mean that gaps and issues that are identified while you're planning shouldn't necessarily be corrected, but they really should be documented and identified as part of that planning process so that you capture that and understand the potential issues. Also, as we talk about this, it should not be about making the exercise a success if your definition is no problems. Because again, it's that same idea of we've got a false sense of what reality is. We've made a test successful, but have we really made our environment and our functional recovery capability more mature or more complete? So consider that. Any thoughts around that? Because sometimes that can be a difficult position, more from an organizational culture or difficulty in being able to say, hey, we might have some failures, if you will. We might have some issues arise rather than everything being perfect.
Hey, Richard, this is Catherine. I was just wondering how you feel about, I've read some thoughts about people, quote, testing to failure. How do you feel about pushing your test or your program to that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I think that goes to really kind of leads into the scope conversation we're going to get to, which is it actually does make sense to try to break things and increase your scope so that something does fail or there is an issue identified, because that's reality. So as you think about that planning, that's one area of planning that you may look at is identifying what those gaps may be or are in your environment and ensuring that the test includes those so that you can see exactly the impact that might have, or that can be the first step in identifying solutions to the failures. So that's really about a scope issue and making sure the scope is large enough. And just as a preview, one of the things that we often will consider is we'll have our base scope, our essential scope, and then we'll have our extended or our push scope, so that we know we'd like to get to this, and this is what we'd really like to try, assuming we have time and things go well enough, that we know might be of difficulty. So you can look at it from that perspective as well.
Okay, thank you.
So as we kind of said, prepare, but don't over plan. Now, that being said, the prepare and don't over plan is a continuum. If this is the first exercise an organization is doing, or you're very new to doing DR exercises, you're going to want to spend a lot more time planning and preparing and making sure people understand and that things are in place, because you just don't want it to be an abject, okay, here are all the issues that could have been resolved with some planning and training, because training is a big part of that. But as you mature and as you've done exercises over time, the amount of planning can go down. So think about that as the overall as we talk through some of these things. But the basic parts of the planning are really organizational planning, right? Is what type of exercise or what portions of those type of exercise do we want to include? Do we have components that have not been, technical components that are relatively new that we want to include in this testing that maybe haven't been fully vetted out? Or we just need to make sure that that the performance and the volume testing can go through those components without necessarily doing full integration or business testing. Then identify the overall scope. We'll talk about scope here in just a second, but the overall scope really is that all those different types, and then the number of applications, how much integration, how many people are you going to use? Are you going to use secondary people, et cetera? That kind of goes down. Once you've understood that scope, then we can come in and identify what is the schedule and the participants going to be. How are we going to fit all of that in back to, is it a 24/7? is it just a workday exercise? How much time do we have? How much time can we pull people away? Even if it's a workday exercise or a 24/7, we know people have other jobs, so they may only be able to have 4 hours on certain days. So that whole scheduling of participants and the integration is really where we consider that planning for the exercise very, very critical, because it's the organizational step. In a real event, obviously, everybody's going to be completely focused on the exercise. And if that can be the type of exercise you do, that might be part of the scope or the type, where we say we're literally simulating a recovery event. Everybody is completely focused on DR for the next 2 days. You don't get to do your other job, so we can focus. Again, that's part of the scope, scheduling, and understanding who the participants are and can they do it. Then we come up with that idea of really some very detailed expectations, and obviously detailed scope. But that execution expectations on what people will be doing, is this a as you have time type of testing, or as you have time type of recovery, or is this completely dedicated time, and we're going to move people into different rooms so that they're away from their desks, they're away from their distractions. Those kind of expectations, as well as communication expectations. This is kind of where the prepare and the training goes, as opposed to just pure execution. For example, we like to be very, very disciplined in our approach. And so having well-defined check-in points, that both with the participants who are performing recovery, as well as management and other individuals, so that we can keep a status, we can keep actions, we can keep all of those items prepared and visible, so that we don't run over time, or we're not just letting time get wasted away. We'll talk about that as we talk about managing the event as well. In some cases, well, in every case, you really want to ensure that there is no production impact, unless you're looking at a complete production failover. But in general, our exercises are, about no production impact. This is actually where we will spend some time from a technical perspective, planning and implementing and making sure that those things don't happen to the best of our ability. Sometimes these DR exercises are more about preparing the test and the test environment to not impact production, if that can't happen, than it is the actual recovery side. Especially when you're isolating networks and you're bringing up environments that may be on the same IP address space, the same server names, so ensuring that there isn't any contamination of your production environment. We've actually had an issue at one exercise where everything was supposed to have been isolated off, everything looked good, and then we all of a sudden found that the test data was moving over to production, and some production data moved into the DR. The production data moving into the DR wasn't harmful so much as they had to recreate that data in production, but the DR data moving over was a big deal, because they had to go in and delete it. That actually happened twice. We thought we had corrected on the next exercise, turned out it hadn't been, and so there was a hole that was left open that somebody didn't know about from a network perspective. Well, those are the type of things that we would spend a tremendous amount of time on in our planning, is that protection of production. Also, that idea of what are the issues and roadblocks that may stop the exercise. Not so much issues that you need to work through, but another example that we found in the preparations by a client was the Thursday before the exercise was supposed to start on the next Monday. It turned out that there had been a major backup or backup change in their architecture, and they wouldn't be able to stop the backups appropriately and continue to protect the environment. Well, that ended up being a major roadblock, and we had to cut out a major portion of the scope because of that environment, and had to just quickly move to the different technology stack that was being tested for that. So really, being upfront and being very thorough in what are the potential issues that in a real event may not occur, but because you're trying to keep everything else protected, or because of the exercise, it may stop. It also could be there are certain areas that have not been protected. There was a miss. We we were lucky in one case where one of the major applications that were in scope for an exercise, it turned out that a major, the application server that runs it had not been backed up and had not been replicated to the offsite location, which basically meant all we had was a database. Well, we were able to, through a back door, bring that back up over and get that application restored. But had we not been able to do that, the exercise pretty much would have been over. That was also an important gap to identify, that we needed to go back in and really look at all of the backup and the replication of data, in the environment to make sure there wasn't anything else critical that was missing. But those type of things and really going through and identifying, what is necessary can be important in this planning phase. The other thing, as we've talked about, is preparing the communication schedule and the communication strategy. So for example, are you going to continue to leverage your help desk during the exercise for any issues? Or are you going to keep that outside of the exercise or outside of the production help desk and control that within the exercise themselves? We've done it in both ways. If you're going to use your help desk, that takes a lot of coordination and planning, because people are going to be calling up, and you obviously want to make sure that the escalation is going to the right individuals and not going to the production escalation of issues. Other items are, how are you going to go about tracking your action items? You're going to stay old school, or are you going to use online tools? To what level are you going to do that? How are you going to consolidate all of that up? Again, as you can see, a lot of this is the organizational side as opposed to just the pure technical preparation. And then, as we've talked, identify the schedule and everything, but put a detailed schedule together in terms of people and recovery, so that you have a good idea of what you expect to happen. This is especially important if you're not doing a 24/7, because most of you probably have an overall recovery strategy or a timeline that you can leverage in terms of priorities, how long different components take. But now, as you start breaking that up, if you only do a workday exercise, or you have to break it out by day or time zones, you want to have what your expected start and end time for all of these are, as opposed to just a general guideline in terms of a 24-hour absolute recovery strategy or timeline. Any questions or comments around those? So what is really the appropriate scope? Really from a scope perspective, we've kind of talked through a lot of this. So kind of in summary of all of that is, if it's a technology exercise, we like to choose representative technologies to ensure that we've got the appropriate validation of the technology. It doesn't necessarily have to be comprehensive from across all applications that are within that, but you may want to do all of the different types of technology. Let's say you have 2 or 3 different backup technologies. Maybe you'll do one backup of each. Or if you have a virtual environment that's running, that you're using, you'll do some of the virtual, but then you have some physical Unix and some physical Windows. Then you might choose several of those to kind of, in general, look and make sure that those technologies are working. But really looking at the overall components of each and making it a broader exercise that way, or could be just more depth. We really want to hit the virtual environment and make sure that it has the performance. Either of those work, but that would be more of a technology base from a scope, and you need to do some of that. From an application, kind of the traditional DR, what's the appropriate scope? As we kind of talked about in that push to failure, you really want to make sure that critical applications are tested really in every exercise if possible, at least once a year, because they are critical, and you want to make sure that any changes in the environment are caught in the DR environment. One of the key points on this slide is the recovery environment is often not in sync with production. We push through new functionality, we make changes, and we have great intentions to make sure the production environment is up to date, but often it gets pushed off because we're delayed, something's going on in the project, we need to get it into production, we'll come back later and put that into the DR environment, and then it doesn't happen. So testing those critical applications really is key because of those changes that go on. Then you can rotate through the less critical applications. We think it's really important that testing should be comprehensive. Your scope needs to include that, even if it's just one or two of the lower, less critical or lower RTO applications. Those should be included in your scope so that at least you can rotate through. Now, that goes back to the technology perspective. You may turn around and say, we're going to do these three because they have the same type of technology and they're less critical. Maybe they're an actual backup and restore as opposed to a replicated environment. That makes a lot of sense, but you want to include that. And then, as we've said before, integration, integration, integration. If there's anything that we're the most scared about in environments is how they integrate and will they work. We're less concerned in most cases that applications will start and that you can log in. We're more concerned that because of the integrated nature today, that part will fail, especially as it relates to SaaS solutions that are coming, are sending data or receiving data from your on-prem solutions out to the cloud and all of that, because often those are special point-to-point connections. Not all of them just go through the internet, if you will. So as we think about, again, the scope, we've kind of I just talked through all of these things, which is, the inter and intra application and the inter and intra departmental workflows. How do those work? Where do the handoffs happen? Are there any special manual procedures? Are there manual jobs that are run that don't get tested kind of in the automated nature? And then as we talked about kind of the third-party integration, making sure that you're working with those third parties and that you can send test data to them and make sure that it works. Really, really important. From a participant's perspective, from a technical, we really encourage all levels, even if they don't have to do anything. A lot of times our network teams push a button, the network is up, it's isolated off, and they're done. But you want to include them and make sure that they're participating in the status calls and all of that, especially as it comes to primary and secondary resources across the technical team. It's amazing the use of secondary resources, what they provide, and how they find issues, and maybe not so much errors, but clarification in plans. Helping the defined procedures become a little bit more automated because there's manual steps or there's things in people's heads that they just do that aren't on the paper. So the secondary resource will probably make unexpected errors just because they're not as familiar with the environments. And then thinking about from an application perspective, what is the actual relocation impact? Are there performance considerations? Are there actual access considerations? Are there special configurations that you need to do? Making sure all of those secondary resources find a lot of those type of items. Now, from a business perspective, we're always including the business folks as well. But kind of skipping on to managing the exercises, we're down to just a few minutes left. The big thing I would share is disciplined action during the exercise. You don't want it to be mass chaos. Sometimes we kind of consider it that way, but we like to make sure that people are acting very disciplined, going through and following the procedures that are defined, and not, for me, one of the scariest things that I see is if I'm helping to manage an exercise and we're managing by walking around, we go up to somebody and say, how's everything going? They're like, great, I'm moving through, I'm on track, or I'm a little ahead. And I'll go, so where are you at in your plan? And they'll have their plan in front of them, and the next thing you know, they flip 4 or 5 pages ahead and go, oh, I'm here. That's not a disciplined approach. It might feel faster, but in a real event, it could actually cause a lot more problems. So, we really want to have people use their documentation and not their memory, and then communicate at every appropriate milestone that you've defined either in your plans or as part of the preparation. People should not start the next task necessarily. If there's a dependency, they need to understand that if there's a dependency, they check in. Is the dependency met? Yes, I can move forward. However you want to do that, whether that's inter-team communication or having a single coordinator handling all of that. Depending on the size of the exercise, it may make sense for the coordinator to handle that so that all of the dependencies are understood. And if people are using their memory, they don't miss a dependency that they didn't know about. The other thing about the disciplined action is communicating the issues, no matter how small you think. With one client, to emphasize this and to kind of make it fun, if you will, was we actually gave out a prize for the person that found the most issues. And so it actually, it was the most issues we've ever found in an exercise. Some of them were probably the kind that were just, notated, that didn't need to be necessarily reported. But to get people in the habit of noting every single thing that comes up is probably a good practice. And then it's easier to back that off and say, well, that's okay going forward. You don't need to, worry about that. But the problem comes into is because most of our IT folks are very problem solving focused, the next thing you know is, hey, we had any problems? No, I didn't have any. When in reality, they fixed 5 or 6 because that's what they do, but they just didn't think about it because it's the natural part of our makeup. We just fix problems. So that disciplined approach, if there's anything about managing the exercise, I would say is critical. And then the use of that timeline that we talked about, and that helps the disciplined approach because you can put it up there and you can look at somebody and say, where are you at? And if they're struggling and they haven't communicated an issue, we all know that time management is a huge aspect of this. And it's usually not that they're not wanting to share the information. It's time goes so fast when we're dealing with problems that the next thing you know, something that was supposed to take 15 minutes is now taking an hour and a half because there was a problem and there was nobody there to stop, pause. Hey, we need to get more people involved to help. So that timeline really helps, again, that disciplined approach and that time management. And as you said, at least a single source for statuses and updates. That doesn't mean that that's the only person that everybody's communicating with, but making sure that in your status updates, that all of that information is coming in and that there really is one action item list. There's one update list. This is the state of the exercise. This is the state of the applications. So just a couple of things that I would add here we've added is we like to always start with a pre-meeting to re-emphasize the communication and methodology and execution expectations, just to remind people. And we will do that every day of the exercise or whenever new shifts are coming on. And we'll do that every single time, just as a reminder. They're not as long in the middle or end, but they're a reminder. And we talked about the status meetings. Now in today's age, having an online tool to share and collaborate on issues and status is very helpful. So sometimes that's good to use, but it might be as easy as a WebEx with your spreadsheet on it. Doesn't have to be necessarily a SaaS tool like a Google Docs or anything else that you have. But having that up and visible can be very helpful, especially flipping between timeline and exercise. And then making sure that the follow-up on issues and the actions that were identified, that's a big part of managing the exercise afterwards. Again, why understanding all those issues. So one of the other questions that often come up is, how do we do more than just one exercise? The reality is you may not be able to do a big, massively scoped exercise more than once a year, but you can do other things. You can do some technical exercises as you plan that out quarterly. You can do some single application exercises, especially as it relates to VM and cloud-based. If you have some maybe DR as a service or cloud-based solutions, you can do those maybe on a more ad hoc basis or even a scheduled basis. And then I would always encourage folks to do these tabletops on a regular basis as well. Make sure that the dependencies and the communication pieces are there. Just that talking amongst people, it's amazing how much smoother than when you actually perform the recovery exercise can go. So now, what do we do with the results? This often we'll see clients, everything went great or there were issues and then it just goes away until the next year. Then we pull them back out and say, hey, did we work on any of these issues? Well, no, because we got busy. So really the thing to do with those results is look at the action items, put them on your DR or your BC checklist so that they get addressed. The other thing that can help here is you may need to adjust your strategy. You may need to have a more complex strategy or a strategy that requires more replication and a shorter recovery time. But you may also find, based on the situation, that what you have in place is either sufficient or you can back it back down because of the speed in which certain recoveries occur. clearly adjusting the recovery procedures and the documentation. If you don't have documentation updates, then I would say that my first answer is that probably wasn't a great exercise. There has to be something that's changed, or there has to be something that was clarified. It might not be massive changes, but we just did an exercise with a client and the secondary person did it, and there weren't any major changes, but there were probably 4 or 5 changes to some procedures to make them more clear. Budget. If you look at what's really happening and you identify the issues, this really can go back to say, this is what our environment is, this is the risk, this is what's happening. And often that can help with the budget as it relates to getting things put in place, as opposed to just cutting something and trying to do it all internally. Now, when I say that, I understand different cultures, and I've lived it myself, where sometimes that isn't always the case. But at least being honest with the results so that our senior management team knows what our capability is really important. Because I've known a couple of situations where the results of the test were always, it's perfect, we're fine, it's great, it's great. And then when it had to happen, they couldn't recover. Very difficult place to be after the fact. Hard to go and say if we should have had things in place, but they're not there. That's a better place to be until after it's really needed. And we talked about action items. So for you, what would be really the next steps? If you haven't done anything, I'd just go look, when was the last exercise? Do you know what the results were? Across the board, what was the scope? If you haven't done anything or you don't have a lot of time, at least look at a technical exercise. We're actually doing that with a client right now. They're migrating away from a certain recovery strategy, and they're changing their whole environment on one of their database platforms. And so their whole replication and everything that needs to be done for critical applications are changing. Well, our DR exercise, we're going to do a technical exercise. We're just going to verify their backup and restore procedures, because they haven't used it from a DR perspective in like 3 or 4 years. So we're going to go back and make sure that works, because for the time being, that is their recovery strategy. They don't anticipate using it, but if they do, that's what's going to happen. So that's our exercise this time. I think it'll be a good one, because we're going to make it a pretty broad scope, a lot of applications being restored. So it'll help that functional and that performance test as well. So as you kind of look where to prioritize, right? What's your base infrastructure? What are your technology gaps? Really look at all of those things, network authentication, integrations, all of that stuff that we kind of think always works really is a good place to look at and make sure that your DR environment has all of those same things and is functionally capable, or at least what is the degradation of performance you might have. Also, what do people know? What do they do? Do they really understand the strategy, their role, and then your SaaS and IIS environments? Where are they? What is their actual capability? What are you responsible for? What's the vendor responsible for? And obviously looking at it as a holistic, what is your validation or your recovery strategy, and does it appear to be valid? So that's really all I've got. And again, I apologize. I want to make sure we got everybody out on time. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes. Are there any questions or thoughts that we might be able to answer for you? Then with the last thing I would say is I use this in a lot of presentations actually.
Rich, you do have
this
a question
just kind of,
here?
I like it. Yeah, I just saw that.
Okay, thank you.
The question is, what maturity level do you find companies are ready to move to a full recovery exercise where they actually run the business at the recovery site? So those are typically going to be at a level, well, it depends, but typically a level 3, level 4, definitely level 5. And so what I would answer, Alan, on that maturity is, what exercises have you performed up to then? If you've performed relatively complex scope, where you've included integration, business users, and the recoveries have been relatively trouble-free, there have been a few issues, minor issues, then you're ready to try that at a recovery site. Ideally, we would even suggest that you would do that in a phased approach if possible. You wouldn't just fail your entire data center over, but maybe you would fail over a couple of applications first and run them productively over there if possible. But in general, once you've gone through a couple of successful very large scope where all of your critical applications have functioned plus some of your other ones, then you'd be at a point to consider actually running it at the recovery site. That actually takes a lot of preparation and planning because you will have had to have done a lot of technical tests as well as these other functional tests to make sure that all of your processing is capable. So maybe the short answer to that is if you haven't done any kind of integration, you're definitely not ready. Your integration test should have been a majority of a part of your scope. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you.
So that is, I guess we've got a minute. So if there are any other questions, you're always free to send me a note. That's my email address. I will respond as quickly as possible and answer the question. I'm happy to do that for whatever you might have. So please feel free. Hopefully there was some good information. And again, we apologize for the technical issues and us starting 10 or 15 minutes late, which kind of compressed things down a little bit. But we appreciate your time, and we appreciate being able to share what we think is important, and hopefully there was some value there. So if there isn't anything else, please feel free to reach out, and thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.